Hi, this is Richard Dolan. I'm here with Joseph Farrell for Richard Dolan Members special podcast. Joseph, good to have you here.
Mm, Thanks for having me.
I love having the video split screen. You're only the second person that I have interviewed in with video. I feel like I'm just joining the modern age just now. So glad we're able to do this. You do video interviews all the time, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're an old hand at this, but I'm just new to the game. We just finished a really great interview on for KGRA Radio for the Richard Dolan Show, and I encourage people to listen to that. That will be on YouTube. And we ended by talking about 9/11, and I wonder if we can just explore that a little bit more.
Sure.
You've had a lot to say and write about 9/11. I'm trying to think, where do we start? What are your thoughts about what 9/11 was about? You ended our last interview by talking about the economic or financial minister to Putin from 2001, just before 9/11. Her name is Tatiana. Could not remember.
Koryagina.
Koryagina. Can you explain that a little bit? What she stated for the members here.
She said in an article that appeared in Pravda, I've got it in my book, Hidden Finance, Rogue Networks, and Secret Sorcery. She said in Pravda, shortly before 9/11, I think it was July of 2001, that the United States would shortly come under attack on its own soil, and the attack would be perpetrated by a cabal, a group of very powerful individuals with assets in excess of $300 trillion. Now, you know the Russians, when they want to come out with something that sounds crazy, they put it in Pravda. If they want to come out with something that doesn't sound so crazy, they'll put it on RT or Sputnik or something like that. But she was deadly serious, and of course the attacks happened. And that fact, incidentally, was reported by our late colleague Jim Marrs.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was interesting because if you look at the 9/11 truth movement, they have basically come down, and I think argued quite well, the hypothesis that at some point, given all the drills that were running concurrently with 9/11 that mirrored certain actual features of 9/11, the security stripping that occurred in that part of the country,
Yes, exactly.
prior to the event, this is straight out of the JFK playbook.
Absolutely.
And that meant that it had to have happened by some rogue network within the American intelligence complex, all right? But the problem that I had with that explanation was President Bush's behavior, and for that matter, our friend Dick Cheney, and I'm using that very tongue-in-cheek. President Bush, if you recall, gave a press conference and said that he was flying immediately back to Washington. Then somewhere between the school, Booker Elementary School, and Air Force One, this all changes. They take off in Air Force One without fighter escort, which just boggles my mind. They put the thing on the tail, and he flies to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, jettisons the press corps, gives another statement in which no mention is made of terrorism.
Uh-huh.
And then he flies on to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, where you had Warren Buffett, I believe, and General Scowcroft or somebody else there as kind of the committee of the emergency committee, if we can harken back to Robespierre days, the Committee of Public Safety.
Yes, right.
So, in other words, it's looking to me like you had a covert government set up there. And Bush is flying to Barksdale and Offutt. Well, why? And here I think Webster Tarpley and Thierry Masson, the French researcher,
Yes.
are absolutely correct in that Bush was actually doing this to reassert personal presidential command over the country's thermonuclear and nuclear forces, because Barksdale is the backup base to Offutt. Okay?
I see.
And the problem here is that means, and by the way, there were thermonuclear drills going on 9/11. So in other words, if you put all this together, it's looking like that rogue group was doing something some group was doing something that was not part of the original plan. Now, let's go to the towers coming down for a moment. everybody in the 9/11 truth movement is latching on to the idea that we needed a new Pearl Harbor. This was in the America's
The
plan
Project for a New American
American
Century, right?
century,
PNAC,
yes.
right?
And Bush himself used that phrase in his speeches subsequent to the event, as if to say, okay, message received loud and clear, this is what we're going with.
Yep.
The problem here that I had is, if you were going to use or stage an event to project American power into the Middle East to fulfill that project, you would not need to collapse the towers. All you would need to do is create the climate of opinion and attack them, cause severe enough loss of life. When the towers come down, they're pinned. In other words, I believe that the destruction of the Twin Towers was not part of that second tier's agenda. It was part of the third tier's agenda. And they had to signal their presence by bringing down the towers in such a fashion that it became very clear that they had some pretty powerful tools.
Third tier, meaning the group that was referred to, that she was talking about in 2001.
Right. Now, who would that group be? I do believe absolutely that it is some version of my Nazi international, Mr. Globaloni international cabal. All right. And the reason why is a little known fact that gets lost in all the 9/11 truth shuffle about Mohammed Atta.
Oh, one of the key pilots, supposedly.
Yeah, one of the key pilots, supposedly. Mohammed Atta was recruited in Cairo. All right. And by the way, there's more than one Mohammed Atta. So we're already in JFK territory with more than one Lee Oswald. But Mohammed Atta, the one that, whose face we've seen, was recruited in Cairo by a couple of Germans. Okay, this came out in Daniel Hofstadter's research. So where does Atta go? Well, he goes to Hamburg again, where he is put up, as we know, this is known in the public narrative, in some middle-class German suburb in Hamburg by some Germans whose names have never been identified to this day.
Wow.
He then comes over to this country, as we know, where he goes to the flight schools in Florida. And again, most of the people that he's in contact with are not people with names like Muhammad or Abdullah or so on and so forth. They're people with names like Hans, Peter, Jürgen, people like this coming over with bucket loads of cash for this guy. So this is a little peculiar, but
yes,
the pièce de résistance for me is that Atta's sponsorship in Germany was by the Karl Duisberg Society, Karl Duisberg Gesellschaft. And if you research this, this is a society that numbers as some of its sponsors the Clintons, Henry Kissinger, and so on. But who's Karl Duisberg? Well, Karl Duisberg, in case you didn't remember, was the CEO of Bayer prior to World War I, continued as CEO of Bayer after its merger to form an infamous cartel that we all know and hate by the name of IG Farben. So in other words, the Karl Duisberg Society is kind of a front for the post-war IG Farben chemical
intimately
cartel,
bound up with the Nazis.
Intimately bound up with the Nazis, and which incidentally also drew up the plan for the modern European Union. And that's another part of the story that people
connected with the Bilderbergers.
Yes, with the Bilderbergers. Yes,
absolutely.
Exactly. So you've got all of this strange connection here to this society in Germany that has its own Nazi overtones. Then I find out that the chief banker that hooked the Bin Laden family up with Deutsche Bank was a fellow by the name of Francois Genoud. Now, being a Nazi researcher, that one sent my suspicion meter right into the red zone, because this is a Swiss Nazi banker that's handling all of those Swiss accounts for the Nazis in post-war Switzerland up until his death, which is in the, I think, early 1990s. So in other words, the Bin Laden family is connected with a Nazi banker who's advising them, put all of your money in Deutsche Bank, which is one of the banks that is putting out all of those puts and shorts on the stock market So there's a German connection here, folks, that has never been explored, and I think this connection is going right to Dr. Koryagina's third tier, this international cabal that's really working behind the scenes to pull this off. And I think the second layer, quite frankly, Richard, I think you're dealing with a penetrated operation. They plan to attack the towers, not bring them down. It's bringing them down that signal to them, you're pinned, you go do what we tell you.
Got it. That's fascinating. So I had not been going into this third layer very much. I've wondered about it. I mean, that's true. But it's the second layer. That is the political layer,
Yes.
the deep state layer. I guess we'll
Yes.
call it that, what we
Right.
think of as the deep state. And I've often wondered, well, what's their motivations? So my motivations have fallen into basically two conclusions. Conclusion number one, to justify a war that would not otherwise be justified, that is steal
Right.
$30 trillion worth of oil under the ground in Iraq and steal the minerals under the ground in Afghanistan and so forth.
Right.
That's one. And then the other reason is maybe even more important, which is to justify a kind of open fascism in the United States.
Yes.
Basically to tell people, you don't have rights anymore. You thought you did. Those are gone. We're going to have a surveillance state. And to justify it on that basis. I still think that's true.
Yes, I do.
But now let's go into motivations of this third tier. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts? Like why would the third tier dissolve the tower? They didn't even collapse the towers. I mean, why did they disintegrate these towers? What's their motivation? What do they have to gain here?
The first motivation is to tell the second tier that we've got access to toys a lot more sophisticated than you do.
Okay.
That's number one. And number two, it's in my opinion, to weaken the United States by military overextension. That's the second objective, which was part of the plan to begin with. But the third objective, I think, and this was the telltale clue that the original plan had been modified, if I can put it that way, in that Bush, after 9/11, when he gets Tony Blair, who incidentally also talks about this cabal, this international cabal, in some of his 9/11 remarks, when Blair is brought over and Bush is in front of Congress and talking about the nations of concern, the axis of evil, well, who's he targeting there? Well, Iran didn't attack us, Afghanistan didn't attack us, and yet here we are, and North Korea didn't attack us. Those were his three nations in the axis of evil. So where do we go? Well, we go into Iraq on a pretense that there are weapons of mass destruction there, and that's a whole other level of my thinking. I think that they were using a bit of code there for something else, ancient, not modern. And Afghanistan.
I'm going to make you come back to that, but keep going.
Yeah. Afghanistan. Why Afghanistan? Well, as far as I'm concerned, and we're going back to the bearer bonds part of this here, Richard, is those bearer bonds were all gold-backed bearer bonds, but gold is also code in criminal circles, international criminal circles, for drugs. So in other words, we might be dealing with drug-backed bearer bonds. They're going into Afghanistan to kick out the Taliban and get their hands back on that opium
Those
trade.
poppy fields, absolutely.
Those poppy fields, which, to them represent billions and billions of dollars.
Well, I've wondered this because the one thing those Taliban did, aside from destroying Buddhist monuments and enslaving women, was they stopped the global opium trade.
Yeah.
I mean, almost down to close to zero, I think. That's where most of the opium. And all that opium exploded under the watchful eyes of NATO troops.
Yep, exactly. I think that's that third tier that's going back to secure that source of funding for the rest of their projects. That's the third tier.
This makes perfect sense.
So, again, 9/11 is, I'm in total agreement, it's an abscess on current American politics and culture that absolutely must be lanced, because this neo-fascist thing that the Republic thugs and the dummy crooks have got us into is just absolutely not working, and it's clear to everybody that it's not working. So I do think that there is an element of truth to those people that are assuming that there is some deep state faction, but a very different one.
Yeah.
That's behind President Trump. I think that's fairly clear
So wait,
because,
stop and back up. Deep state
sure,
faction behind President Trump?
yeah, but a different one, but
So
a
yeah,
different one.
I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
Well, the way I look at it, and I was saying this the moment that Trump announced that, this is not a pretend candidacy. This has some teeth to it, and the reason why is Trump himself. I mean, what do we have? Well, we have a real estate developer. We have a guy that's heavily into casinos. Casinos. I've been in the business myself. Casinos took a real hit after Obamacare. I mean, Vegas began to just dry up, and I had people that were friends out there working in casinos out there.
Hmm.
So without that discretionary income, you're affecting a significant portion of the economy and its bottom line. And Trump represents that interest group. And of course, being a real estate developer in New York, he's got to have ties to the mob, to the mafia. One of his personal lawyers was Roy Cohn. I mean,
Exactly.
you can't get more mafia connected than Roy
No,
Cohn.
indeed.
But this is not to say anything good or bad about Trump. It's just his network of connections. So he's representing an interest group that would have good reason to want to reverse course. And in addition to that, I to this day cannot believe that the rogue element that pulled off 9/11 is the only element that there is in the deep state. I think that there are certain elements that were looking at all of this and said, we need to figure out a way out of this impasse and put somebody in there that can at least try and reverse course. And that's exactly what I think they did.
Do you have a thought on QAnon? Because that's really the thesis of QAnon. Have you been delving into this?
I have been, listen, Richard, I have been watching it. I have been following it, but I'm not a follower. Because so much
Sounds like me. That's like me.
Yeah, the QAnon phenomenon, take it from a patristic scholar. There are aspects of this thing that I'm getting the waft of religion, and not a very good religion. Because what do you have? Well, you have an oracle, and then you have his apostles trying to figure out what exactly the oracle is referring to.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's actually right.
Yeah.
Well, the one thing I'll just say, my own observation of QAnon. I mean, I'm not a QAnon expert. There are people who've really thrown themselves into it, but it's very clear that I don't think this is a LARPer, as people have said in the gaming community. This is way beyond. This is someone who's. I don't think it's possible to say the things that Q has been saying without being a true insider, without having a definite. So it's someone who's real. It's someone who truly does believe that Trump is working against the deep state for the good of the American people. I mean, that's their perspective. And the real question is, how accurate are they? And I don't really have an answer to that. I just you follow it too.
Some of the QAnon drops have been very accurate and very prescient, and this is why it's gained so much traction. But my problem with QAnon is that everybody's viewing whoever's doing these drops as an individual. No, I think QAnon is a front for a group.
Yeah.
A team of people, and in turn, that team, given the nature of what's being said and how it's being said, there's a lot of neuro-linguistic programming going on that tells me that there's deep intelligence connections. There's a lot of, I think, computing power behind it. And I think that computing power, therefore, means that it has to come from somebody with access to that kind of computing power to pull all these threads together and make these drops. So I'm not ruling out anybody. I'm not ruling out
computing power. Almost, I'm going to guess you're saying this maybe because a lot of those messages by Q have been so cryptic, like they've needed to be decoded in a very kind of sophisticated way. So is that what you mean when you say computing power?
Well, it's that, plus the fact that the drops often seem like he's throwing out a dot here and he's throwing out a dot there, and he's doing so in a deliberate way to force you to make connections between them and go out and find the connections. Well, to find those connections, what do? Well, you go on the internet, you use your computer, you do searches, and you pull up articles.
Oh, yes.
But this is happening with such a speed and volume that, to me, there's a team behind this, and they've got access to some pretty sophisticated ways of searching for things. And that tells me that this is either coming from that disenfranchised state faction of the deep state that's not the faction that was backing Hillary, but the opposing faction.
Right.
And I would not rule out the possibility that you are dealing with an international team. In other words, Russians may be involved, Germans may be involved, Israelis may be involved. Who knows? That
That's interesting.
this thing may be much more than people are thinking in terms of what Q actually is and what it's connected to. The other thing that bothers me about it is that the phenomenon arises almost at the same time that, in a certain sense, things like WikiLeaks, the group Anonymous, and so on kind of dropped off the radar.
Well, basically due to intense pressure against them legally and in every other way. I mean, you have the U.S. government in particular and the U.K. trying to destroy WikiLeaks.
Yeah, well, this is my point. That this is the response to that pressure. This is another thing that was created, to kind of continue this flow of information.
That's a really good point.
So it's to me, it's a mystery. I'm not on board with the QAnon thing, but I do follow it. I do recognize that there have been some incredibly accurate predictions and some.
I had to dig into it. I have had people for months telling me, Richard, you have to look at Q. And I just said, look, when I get to it, I had not gone into it. And I finally started looking, and I thought, well, there's something there.
Yeah, there's definitely something there.
Yeah.
But whether it's good or not, time will tell. Again, it's the quasi-religious overtones of this that bother me. There's kind of an overtone of Trump messianism in it. There's
yes, big time.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah.
There's this overtone of one fellow keeps reiterating that and analyzes the QAnon phenomenon. Trust the plan. Well, this is some big providential mystery. It's like the rapture. We've got our Bible charts of the ages, and we're pin everything
not
down.
A fan of that. Not a fan.
I'm not a fan of that either.
No. Well, that's very interesting. Look, Joseph, I've kept you here for quite a long time, and I would just encourage viewers of this interview also to check out the prior interview that we had just done for KGRA, which really segues nicely into this. But look, you're a busy man, and I don't want to keep you any longer from your work.
My pooch is whining; she wants to go out. So.
There we go. So anyone who wants to follow Joseph can go to GizaDeathStar.com. It's his excellent website. Lots going on there. Joseph Farrell, thanks. Thanks so much for your time. We'll catch you again.
All right. Thanks for having me back, Richard.
Later. Bye.